All right. So welcome. I'm going to talk to you all about responsive and adaptive tactics for Blazor applications. We're going to touch a little bit on Blazor Hybrid as well. So we're talking about building layouts that can adapt to different screen sizes, desktop, web, mobile, all of those things. And this is something that I've been working on for quite some time. I've been a web developer for about 20 years now. My name's Ed Charbon. I'm a principal developer advocate at Progress Software, and I've been focused on Telerik UI for Blazor and the Blazor framework for about the past 3 to 4 years. I've also got a link to a free ebook about Blazor that I could share with you at the end here. And if you ever want to reach out to me, just ping me on Twitter. And I also stream on Twitch quite frequently on the Code It Live channel and on a channel that I have by my own name. So let's talk about responsive design and what exactly responsive design is. So we're talking about flexible layouts, layouts that can adapt to multiple screen sizes. We're also talking about flexible content. So we want the content within those designs to be flexible as well. That's going to help these layouts adjust. And then there's a real key component here called a media query. I'm going to show you how to use all of these things together to build some flexible layouts today. A great example of a responsive website or a web application is pretty simple here. If you look on the left-hand side, we have a mobile application. We've got all of our content kind of stacked in a nice scrollable tube. And then as we get more screen real estate and the screen is expanded, those elements tend to flow a little bit more onto that surface. And then when we hit a desktop, we've got plenty of space to just expand our content out. And much more real estate to work with. So I'm going to show you how to do that with a couple techniques. Now, one of the reasons this is really important, it's always been pretty important if you suspect you're going to have people visiting your web application from a mobile browser. But now with Blazor Hybrid and Maui, we definitely are targeting some mobile users. So the idea behind Maui is that we want to target desktop users and mobile users, and these applications are going to be packaged and delivered to those systems. So we definitely need to have things in place to adapt our layouts to run on those smaller screen sizes. And if you're not familiar with what Blazor Hybrid is yet, I'm sure there's been some content here on .NET Conf about Blazor, or sorry, Maui. Blazor Hybrid is a part of Maui or a stack on top of Maui that lets us run our Blazor applications within a Maui application. And those run natively on the desktop and on mobile. So if you haven't learned about Blazor Hybrid yet, check out the latest edition of Code Magazine because there's an article that I wrote in there that gives you real in-depth detail about what Blazor Hybrid is. Now, when we do responsive design and we do layouts for our applications these days, a lot of us reach to these frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind. And these are excellent places to start if you're not really familiar with CSS. One of the downfalls to using these, though, is that you do not end up learning CSS at the end of the day. You learn the frameworks. There are some real simple techniques that have come with the latest versions of CSS that almost make these frameworks obsolete. You're not going to need these for layouts anymore. You can actually do this with just regular CSS these days. So I'm going to show you two techniques that you can use to make layouts that are super flexible. And then we'll add in things like media queries and then some other libraries to do additional things to adapt our layouts. So the first one that I want to talk about is CSS Grid. This is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system for the web. This is something that you might be familiar with coming from like a XAML background. There is a grid layout component in XAML. And the web, we have something like this too, but it exists in CSS and it's called CSS Grid. So again, this is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system. We'll talk about what a one-dimensional system looks like next, but focus on the two-dimensional part for a moment because we're going to talk about grids with columns and rows. So with a grid, we define multiple columns, and then we can define multiple row templates as well. And I have some good demos that we can jump into right away and take a look at how to implement these. And as I do that, I'm going to share a couple links here. First of all, if you're a desktop developer and you're coming to Blazor or web development, I wrote an article on how to do layouts and showed the similarities between those components in the XAML world versus those components in the HTML and CSS world. So I've dropped a link on Twitch. If you're on Twitch, you'll be able to grab that article and take a look. I'm also going to drop another link here. This is a link to something called Telerik REPL for Blazor. So the demos that I'm showing today, you can actually run right in your browser, even if you don't have Blazor installed or .NET installed on your system. All you have to do is open up a web browser, and you can come right in here and tinker with the code and see it run right live in the browser. So I'll drop a link for that as well for our Twitch audience. So I'm going to jump into Visual Studio. You can play along there at home if you have that link to the Blazor REPL. But I want to go into Visual Studio because I have the live or hot reload enabled on this project, and we're going to do some work. So this is a regular Blazor application, and we have some different components that we're going to be looking at and changing some layouts for. And we're going to focus first on some pages here. So I have a page that's dedicated to showing how the grid works, a stack layout page or Flexbox page, and then we'll do a more complex weather application. Notice that we have a file underneath each of these that has a dedicated CSS file for each of the components. So I have index.razor and index.razor.css. This is CSS isolation for Blazor. So each CSS file is associated with those components and scoped directly to those components. So you're not going to get interference between different CSS overriding one another. So let's start with the grid layout. So I've got a div container, and this is the main layout here. And I've got several elements underneath that I want to organize into a grid. And you can see those elements being rendered out here on the right-hand side. And these are just kind of getting dropped into the browser. There's no real layout at all here. What I actually want to do is split this up into two grid columns. So I want to take this and break it down into a grid. And then I want to have a column here on the left that is a little bit smaller than the column on the right. So let's look at the CSS for this, and we can discuss how we can do this with CSS Grid. Remember, CSS Grid is a two-dimensional layout. So the first thing I want to do is adjust my CSS for the main layout of this page. And I'm going to come in here, and I've got these lines commented out so you don't have to watch me clumsily type over my code. And the first thing I want to add is display grid. This is going to put the element in a grid display mode. So we'll hit save here, and hot reload over here is taking place. You can see there's a little bit of a change here just with the sizing of each of those items. Now I'd like to add a little bit of spacing between each of the grid items. So I'm going to come in here and on comment this line gap. So what gap is doing is it's putting space between the items. Notice I said between. So when we're using CSS Grid, we could use something like padding or margin to define the spacing between these items. But if we use gap, what that's going to do is only focus on the white space between each item and not the first and last item where you might have white space before or after if you're using padding or margin. And those things kind of get tricky, and you have to add extra CSS code to eliminate the padding and margin on the tops and bottoms of those items. So I'm going to use gap here, and that's going to solve a lot of problems for me and give me nice white space. The next thing I want to do is break this into columns. So I'm going to say grid template columns, and I'm going to use what is called a fractional unit here. I'm going to focus in on this for a second because this is really important. I'm telling the grid to give me a 3x5 layout. So the first column is going to be 3 fractions, and the second column is going to be 5 fractions. And that is basically a ratio of space that the two columns occupy. So because I have two values here, the value on the left is the left-hand column, the value on the right is the right-hand column, and they are going to be a ratio of space for those two columns. So now I've already broken this into a two column layout. The next thing I want to show is we can create repeating layouts, layouts that have a template that they follow for each number of items. So for each of these sets of grid columns or grid rows, rather, I want the first row, the lighter gray color, to be twice the size of the second item. And I can do that with another template. And this time I'm going to template on the rows. And I'm going to say grid auto rows instead of grid template rows. So I use the keyword template versus auto. Auto is going to repeat a layout automatically. So now you can see the light gray boxes are twice the size of all the dark gray boxes. And that's because they are two fractional with more than the next element. So it's a 2-to-1 ratio. I have 2-to-1 on every time these rows repeat. And that template will repeat each time there are two rows. So now this is a really easy way to break up our layouts into these nice grids. And I'm going to take a look in the dev tools here for a minute because the dev tools actually give me a lot of help. I probably need to go full screen to show this correctly. We'll move this across here. And when I highlight the main layout of the view that we have here, notice that we can actually see the grid in our browser. So with our developer tools, we can see this nice and clear. And then there's an additional button here that says grid over on the right-hand corner. So I'm going to click this button, and this is going to enable some debugging for the grid layout as well. So you'll notice when I have that button toggled, I have the coordinates for each of the columns and rows and where those items begin and end. So I have 1, 2, 3, and so on. So I have an XY coordinate that I can work with when I'm trying to debug things. So it's important to look in your dev tools and see how these tools can help you when you're stuck in a situation you can't figure out what exactly is going on. So I'm going to move on here. We don't have a whole lot of time. We're going to jump over to Flexbox. Now, Flexbox is a one-directional flow layout system. So we're not talking rows and columns this time. We just want to define how our elements are flowing throughout the layout. So we're going to go with either a left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, bottom to top flow layout. And we can adjust on how these wrap, how they span the space, etc. And these two design systems are not mutually exclusive. We can use them together, and I'll show that in a moment as well. So let's take a quick look at how we can use this layout in our application. So we're going to go over to this Flexbox page, and I'll close out our grid code here. And you can see I have a div with a couple paragraphs inside of each of these sets of elements. So let's look at the CSS code here and see how we can make these a little bit more flexible. So I'm going to change this to display flex. And you're not going to see a whole lot of change here because we're going to set the direction of the Flexbox to be a column layout. So we're not going to see a whole lot change there until I start aligning items. Now, aligning things in CSS was difficult back a while ago. And now we can align things very easily using Flexbox. And I'm not sure if my hot reload is still working. So let's do a little bit more here. I'm going to take the second set of elements and we're going to flex these as well. And we're going to set the direction to row. And just as I suspected, I don't think I'm getting a proper update here. Let's try gap and see if this affects our layout at all. It did not. So let's go see if something happened to our running application. Maybe my watch stopped running in the background. Something seems to have stopped. So try. And we'll go with Flexbox. There we go. So now what I've done is on the first set, I've enabled Flexbox and I've told it to align all of the elements to the center. And on the second set of elements, I'm telling them to justify to the center. Now, when you talk about alignment with CSS, it's in the terms of align, align is going to be horizontal alignment, or sorry, vertical alignment, and justify is going to be horizontal alignment. So I'm able to align these items very easily here. Now, if we want to put these items together, we can do that as well. And that's what I'm going to look at in the next demo is we're going to take the idea of using a grid and a flexbox and put them together with some components. So I have a couple components in this view. I've got a weather container, which is just the main layout for these components to fall into. And then I've got the three components, weather today, weather high low, and a weather symbol. Now, pizza seems to be the theme of the show today. I feel like I should have had a pizza demo. I feel like I've been left out of a memo or something. So maybe instead of a weather symbol, we should have pizza in here. And I can be the part of the pizza crowd. There we go. So it's cloudy with a chance of pizza today. So we've got our pizza logo there. But let's focus on laying this out. All right, so I'm going to split this up into a grid now, and we already have some flex boxes inside of those components that we just built. So the first thing I want to do, again, on the container, I'm going to set this to grid, and that's going to give me a grid element in a grid layout. And I'm going to set up those template columns again. This time it's a 1 fraction wide by 2 fractions wide. And notice this isn't quite the layout I probably want. What I actually want to do here is I want this side to have the weather information that is here, but I want to span that across the bottom and make that a nice um, footer on the bottom here. And I want to take the pizza or the weather logo and put it in the upper left hand corner. And then I want to shift this over here. And that might sound like a difficult task, but with Flex or with CSS Grid, this is actually pretty easy to do. So the first thing I need to do, since I am using components and I'm using CSS isolation, I want to target the CSS that is within the weather layout component, the high-low component. So I'm going to use a deep selector to make sure I get the topmost CSS selector of that component. And then I'm going to tell it where I want it to show up in the grid. So I want it to show up in column 1, but I want it to span across both rows in that column or both columns in that row. The next thing I want to do is take my weather symbol and I'm going to tell it to go ahead and render in the upper left-hand corner of the grid. And I did that by saying grid column and grid row and giving it coordinates and how many columns it will span or rows that it will span. Now, the source order of those components didn't matter because I'm directing that component with CSS and telling it exactly where I want it to live. So that is the power of CSS Grid and Flexbox. The next thing we're going to talk about is media queries. So media queries allow us to detect what screen size our application is running at. And then we're going to adapt the CSS to tell it maybe to change some of these grid columns, rows, or some sizes of elements on the screen. So let's take a look back at our grid CSS. Now on our grid CSS, I've got the wrong screen up here. Kill that one. There we go. If we go back to our grid, you can see when I shrink this down, maybe I'm on a mobile device, I still have 2 columns. It's a little bit cramped. So let's see how we can fix that. So one of the things that I like to tell people is to do mobile first. So before you start adding media queries, make the first set of CSS that the browser is going to see be the mobile layout. So what we're going to do is we're going to take away these grid columns for a minute. So we'll take those out and notice I've got a single column layout. That's exactly what I want. That is actually the default if no grid columns are defined for a CSS grid. So I don't even have to specify anything. You could add a one column layout there if you wanted to, but by default, that's what we're going to get. And then I'm going to detect with a media query what size my browser is capable of showing. And I've got this set to a min width of 768. So these kind of are backwards logic to me. This says if I can show at least a minimum of 768 pixels, then I'm going to apply these next CSS styles. So if it is greater than 768 pixels, I'm going to take the main layout and then put those same templates that I had before in there. Now, if I open this back up, you'll notice that I've got a nice responsive layout. When I'm on a bigger screen, I get two columns, and as I scale down, I get one. So that's pretty cool. I can do that with CSS media queries. But what if I wanted to detect something at runtime? This isn't a perfect world where I'd get to define everything at design time. I might have multiple items coming in from a database. I've got a for each loop running over items. And maybe I need to make some logical decisions based on the screen size and how I want to display these items. So let's talk about a library that I wrote called Blazor Size. This is giving us the ability to detect through C# code what the media query on that device is, and then we can adapt our code to render the UI differently, or we could even throttle how much data is coming over the wire if we feel like a mobile device should have maybe less records being pulled in, those type of things. So what a runtime media query gives us is we can set up a component that has a specified breakpoint, which is the media query itself. Again, greater than 768 pixels, for example. And then it's going to bind to a Boolean value in the code. And we will get an event that triggers every time that media breakpoint is uh, crossed. So if the browser expands, then we'll get an event that triggers and says, "Hey, the browser just got bigger and it crossed that threshold." So now we can trigger on that, and we could say, if there's a small device detected, go ahead and show weather cards and we'll pass it the weather forecast data. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and show weather in a grid. So maybe we've got more real estate. We could show a full data grid on the screen um, versus just showing them as cards. So I've got a demo here now that I'm going to show you. And this is running .NET MAUI. So again, this is really important for MAUI because I might be running my application in a desktop like this, where I have plenty of room for my weather forecast page to show a full data grid. But I also might have users that shrink the screen down and pin it to the side of their display, and I want to show some cards here. So I've completely changed out the display component. And I also might have users that installed the same application on an Android device. So now I'm running Blazor natively on an Android device with MAUI inside of a Blazor web view. And notice I have the weather cards here. I don't have a data table crunched into the small space. That's because Blazor size is detecting the screen size and it's saying you only have enough room to show so much. Let's go ahead and use weather cards instead of weather data. We can completely swap out the display component. So that is one technique that you can use. All you have to do is install the package, and with a few lines of code, you can be set up for that. And if you want to see that live in the browser right now, I've got another link that I'm posting in the Twitch chat for a Blazor REPL where you can just open the browser and check that code out. Last but not least, I want to mention I work for Progress, the folks that make the Telerik UI for Blazor. And if you're the type of developer that would rather have a component to define your CSS grid and your Flexbox, we actually have components that do this. So we have a grid layout component, we have a stack layout component, and the work that I did on the Blazor size package is also a research and development for media query component that we have in Telerik UI for Blazor as well. So if you already are using Telerik UI for Blazor, there's no need to install another third-party dependency to get that media query component. We have it there too. So this should leave me just a minute for some questions. I'll throw resources up here on the page. I think we started a little tiny bit late, so this might be able to give the wonderful folks in the studio a few seconds of their time back to catch up.
That's cool.
And sync up.
We appreciate that. So I've got us up on screen now, and what I'm going to do now is remove your thing, and then we're going to add the questions to the stream. This first one will probably make you happy. Your partner has been watching you. Hi, Alyssa. We want to say hi to you. She wanted to celebrate you being on live at .NET Conf, so we wanted to go ahead and pull her up on screen.
Thanks, Alyssa.
Cool. And we did have one other question here that might be a loaded one. Did it go away? It was basically, where did it go?
Down a little bit more.
Down a little bit more.
Yeah. Getting so many good ones. It got a little lost.
Here it is. This one's probably a loaded question. What do you think about that one, Ed? From Vittorio, .NET Conf, the eternal question is Blazor or Razor?
Blazor or Razor?
Yeah.
So I wish I had time. I actually think I did this for .NET Conf 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah? Maybe? Okay.
Where I did a talk about what the actual differences are between Blazor and how it renders components. So .razor versus .cshtml. On the coding experience, not a whole lot of differences there. You use the @ symbol, you create some code, some HTML and some scripting and things.
Got it.
Under the covers, those things are compiling to two wildly different things. And I think I talked about that 2 years ago on .NET Conf.
That's cool. You should maybe post a reply to that question, maybe with a link to that old .NET Conf session, since we still probably got all those online.
I'll absolutely go back and look through the Twitter feed and try to answer as many questions as I can.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Well, thanks a lot, Ed.